Good morning. This is going to be the seventh lecture for the second testing period of History 2303. We are literally at the point of talking about the end of the war coming to an end in April and May of 1865 and starting the period known as Reconstruction. We ended our tape last time talking about the desire of Abraham Lincoln and then his successor, Andrew Johnson of Tennessee, wishing that Reconstruction be an easy and painless as humanly possible process for the southern states that had attempted to rebel against the United States of America. Lincoln wanted that, as his successor eventually, Andrew Johnson, because Lincoln never recognized the legality of Confederate secession. Lincoln didn't believe that the Confederates had committed treason because, as I probably pointed out in class, the only crime for which your national government can put you to death for is that of treason, according to the Constitution. If Lincoln would have taken a hard line against the Confederacy, every Confederate official, every Confederate soldier who took an oath of allegiance to fight for the Confederacy had technically committed treason. And so huge numbers of Southerners could have been executed or thrown into jail and held indefinitely because of treasonous activity. But Lincoln said, nope, this is a civil war. And we in American history have come to believe that he was right. That although it was one of the worst events in our national history, nevertheless, Lincoln believed that it was a civil conflict. Another adjective for civil is domestic. You know, when the police send out a patrol car to investigate a civil dispute, most often it's a husband and wife having an argument, or a boyfriend, girlfriend, conflict, etc. A civil dispute, a family dispute, a domestic dispute. And Lincoln said this terrible war, 1861-1865, is a terrible conflict, but is still fought between brother and sister states within the American Union. So Lincoln never recognized the secession of the South. He always wanted, before he died at the end of the war, to support an easy Reconstruction after the Union prevailed militarily in the Civil War. Andrew Johnson, Vice President and now President of the United States upon the death of Abraham Lincoln, was a Unionist, Southern Unionist, who had supported the North during the war. And Andrew Johnson had no use for the slave owners of the South. He was pretty much against slavery. But yet he was a Southerner, and as a Southern president, he didn't want to harm the South. And so he adopted a liberal perspective that Abraham Lincoln had held before him as President of the United States. Now, when Reconstruction came to an end in Texas, there was chaos, because when a government falls from power, there is a void, and that void is called anarchy. With no government, people, do strange things. They rob, they loot, they kill, they run naked in the street, etc., because there are no social standards, there are no laws that govern the behaviors of the people. When the Confederacy fell at the end of the Civil War, the state treasury was looted in July the 11th of 1865, and we think of the Germans in Texas as being law-minded people in central Texas. The state granary, where they held stores of grain in LaGrange, Texas, was promptly, when word came that the Confederacy had fallen, the good citizens of LaGrange went down, broke into the granary, and carried off every drop of surplus grain that the Confederate Texans had stored at that facility at LaGrange. So the reality is that someone needed to bring some order to Texas quickly, because when civil law ends, anarchy prevails. In the state of Texas, Indians would begin to threaten, particularly out on the western frontier, Texas citizens. And despite the emancipation of blacks as a result of Union victory in the Civil War, very little was done to protect the newly freed black population. Abraham Lincoln had, as we said, favored a liberal plan for Reconstruction. In December of 1863, before Congress, he announced that any Confederate state re-entering the Union would be able to re-enter the Union when the war was over, when the North had prevailed on the battlefield, when just 10% of every former Confederate state that had voted in the 1860 election would now step up after the war was over and declare themselves to be loyal American citizens in the future. Why did he use 1860 and the 10% figure that he did? Well, if you go back to the elections in 1860, that was the election immediately before the American Civil War, in virtually every southern state, particularly in Texas, about 10% of the people of every southern state said, no, we don't want to risk secession and civil war and conflict over Negroes. They're not worth it. If that means doing away with slavery, then fine, we're willing to do away with slavery. For instance, in Texas, we know that in the secessionist vote that took Texas out of the United States and into the Confederacy at the beginning of the war, that Central Texas overwhelmingly, and Kirk County and Gillespie County, where Fredericksburg is, and Kendall County, routinely and overwhelmingly voted against secession. So well over 10% of those who had voted in the 1860 election in Texas had opposed the act of secession. And so by taking that figure, when 10% of those who had voted in the 1860 election chose in any former Confederate state to declare their allegiance to the United States of America, Lincoln said when 10% of those who had voted in 1860 show their allegiance to the United States, I'm pulling the Union troops out, and the former Confederate states can elect new officials and draw up new constitutions to replace their Confederate state constitutions, and as far as I'm concerned, Reconstruction's over. And so he made it very easy by setting the 10% standard in 1863. But the radical Republicans in Congress wanted to punish the South, and indeed they had a plan in March of 1864 that would punish the South. The radical plan for Reconstruction was that every former Confederate, soldier, official, anyone who took the oath of allegiance to the Confederacy would be disenfranchised, couldn't vote, they couldn't run for office. In fact, the only people that would be able to vote in the southern states were Unionist supporters of the North during the Civil War, and apparently the free black man that the Republicans intended to give the vote to after emancipation. And when would Reconstruction end and the federal troops leave the South? When 50% of the adult male voting population declared their allegiance to the United States of America. Then the federal troops would be withdrawn. The problem with that is that after the Civil War, in every southern state, including Texas, there was this thing called the Lost Cause, capitalized L and C. The Lost Cause was a belief that what the Confederates had done was noble and decent and good, and despite the fact that they had been defeated on the battlefield, that the Lost Cause was a good thing. And so with the Lost Cause gaining ground in the South after the Civil War, there was no way that 50% of the voting population, males, of any southern state were going to say, mea culpa, well boy, wasn't I stupid who have rebelled against the United States of America, and the Lost Cause was a mistake, it was stupid of me, and now I've suddenly seen the light of day and I want to be a good American citizen. It wasn't going to happen. The radical Republicans might as well have chosen when 101% of the population, voting population of the South, would commit to being loyal American citizens. You couldn't get 101%. Well, they couldn't get 50%. Lincoln was going to be lucky to get 10% of those who had voted in 1860. So, after the Civil War, well, even immediately after the Civil War, excuse me, in May the 17th of 1865, Andrew Johnson, President of the United States, issued what was called the Texas Proclamation, in which he announced that he was naming the Texas Unionist A.J. Hamilton as the provisional post-war governor of Texas. And on June the 2nd, the very same day that Confederate Kirby Smith surrendered in Galveston, Union General Philip Sheridan, in command of the 5th Military District of Texas and Louisiana, with his headquarters in New Orleans, sent General Gordon Granger to Galveston, Texas, before Hamilton could arrive. And on June the 19th of 1865, in our last lecture, we acknowledged that Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston and announced the Emancipation Proclamation, announced the emancipation of all Texas blacks on June the 19th of 1865. By the end of the war, the Civil War, there were 50,000 federal troops in Texas, but most of those troops were concentrated along the Rio Grande River, protecting the border, given that the French had installed Maximilian as Emperor of Mexico. And we were going to have problems with the French and Maximilian's government in the future. In fact, federal troops in Texas met little resistance, and in some cases, federal troops were very popular. For instance, Brevet General George Armstrong Custer arrived in Austin in November of 1865, and he and his wife Libby were very popular and immediately were adopted by the social set of Democrats in Austin, Texas. In fact, when I was an undergraduate at the University of Texas, if you know where the Super Drum is, where they play basketball at the University of Texas, next door is what's called the Little Campus. And I had classes, teacher certification, when I was seeking teaching certification to be able to teach in the public schools. And I actually had a class in one of the buildings, and on the back wall of that building was a sign that said Custer slept here, because it was where he and Libby were. The Little Campus was a United States military post at the time, and it was where Custer and Libby lived while they were in Austin in 1865 and 1866. Texas Governor Andrew Jackson Hamilton arrived in Galveston on July the 21st of 1865, and in early August he immediately established a state government in Austin. He appointed James Bell as the Texas Secretary of State and William Alexander as the Texas Attorney General. And Hamilton also set dates for a convention for the selection of delegates to a planned February the 7th, 1866 State Constitutional Convention. Because understand that the state of Texas had as its governing document the defunct 1861 Texas State Constitution as part of the Confederacy. So that now that the Confederacy ended, they had to replace the state constitution. When the February 1866 convention met, there were two distinct factions. First of all, Texan John Hancock and other pre-war Unionists opposed the pre-war secessionist Calhoun Deep South Democrats like J.R. Runnels and Orrin M. Roberts and other secessionists. However, a large group of the delegates to the February 1866 convention did not support either side, either the diehard Unionists are the secessionists who had taken Texas out of the Union in 1861. J.W. Throckmorton was elected the president of the convention, largely because he had been a pre-Civil War Unionist supporter, but then when Texas left the Union, J.W. Throckmorton had become a Confederate general and served the Confederacy and Texas during the Civil War. So he was a compromise candidate, and so both factions elected J.W. Throckmorton. On the issue of the right of Texas to secede back in 1861, the delegates of this convention never addressed that issue, preferring to simply acknowledge the supremacy of the United States Constitution. The convention agreed that slavery no longer existed because of it shouldn't be reestablished in Texas, but they refused to approve the 13th Amendment, which outlawed the institution of slavery, arguing that that slavery was no more because the North had won the Civil War, and that it was not necessary for the southern states, like Texas, to ratify the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. The convention did provide some security for black citizens, and that's what the 14th Amendment was all about, but the 14th Amendment would not be approved by this convention. The convention also denied Texas Negroes the right to vote, and the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, giving Negroes the right to vote, was pending, but the Texas Convention said, we're not going to ratify, nor are we going to turn down the 15th Amendment, but we're sure as heck not going to give Negroes the right to vote in Texas. The 1866 Constitutional Convention did not satisfy the wishes of Andrew Johnson, because the new President of the United States wanted suffrage granted to all literate black males. And the convention not only repudiated the Confederate war debt, but it canceled all Texas state debts incurred during the war. The convention called a election to be held in June of 1866 to elect a new state government to serve under this soon-to-be new Constitution for Texas. Unionists in Texas supported former Governor Elijah M. Peace, while conservatives supported J.W. Throckmorton. Throckmorton said, I support what Andrew Johnson is doing, but I still oppose black secession for Texas blacks in any shape, form, or fashion. Elijah Peace, on the other hand, said, I will support suffrage if elected as governor for Texas blacks. The results of the June 1866 election revealed that Throckmorton won overwhelmingly, 49,000 votes to Peace's 12,000 votes. Throckmorton was inaugurated August the 9th of 1866, and the President of the United States, on August the 20th, Andrew Johnson, declared that, as far as he was concerned, the insurrection of Texas, resulting from Texas attempting to leave the Union in 1861, was formally over, because Texas had now elected a new government. The Texas legislature immediately met, and the legislature appointed David G. Burnett, who had been a Unionist before the Civil War, and Orrin M. Roberts, who had been the president of the 1861 Secessionist Convention that took Texas out of the United States, as the two elected United States senators. Neither man would be seated in Congress due to the fact of a July 1862 national congressional law that required oaths of allegiance to the Constitution, and refused to allow anyone who had taken an oath of allegiance after that to the Confederacy to ever serve in national office again. Following Throckmorton's advice, the Texas legislature did not act on the 13th Amendment, and by vote specifically rejected the 14th Amendment, which provided for civil rights for blacks. Ignoring those like former Confederate John Reagan, who had served in the government of the South, ignoring advice from Reagan and others who said, every time you don't do what the radical Republicans in Washington want, you're just putting another cartridge in the gun that's being held to Texas' head, and you ought to accommodate the President of the United States, if not the radical Republicans, in the Congress of the United States. But what did the Texas legislature do in 1866? They passed a series of black codes that would govern the behavior of the freed Negro, now freed from the institution of slavery. And black codes were designed, literally, to develop a caste system that would ensure that Negroes would always remain inferior to whites in the state of Texas. And it restored Negroes to inferiority now legally without ever again having the institution of slavery. Black codes, for instance, were passed in Texas that prohibited prohibited laborers of all races, but particularly directed toward Negroes. Laborers could not leave their work without permission, and visitors couldn't visit with laborers during work hours and interrupt the work in the fields that Negroes were doing. And specific black codes were passed that prescribed that Texas Negroes be, quote, obedient and respectful to Texas whites. So what Texas did, as all southern states did, was pass a series of black codes that governed the behavior of their free black citizens, even though there was no more slavery, legal slavery. They passed black codes to make sure that the behavior of Negroes and their ability to rise up the socioeconomic ladder would be inhibited to the point where Negroes would always remain inferior to whites in Texas and in the South. The Freedmen's Bureau was created by Congress in March of 1865, and in September of 1865, the Freedmen's Bureau opened operations in Texas under Union General E.M. Gregory, former United States General. This agency would intervene on behalf of Texas blacks and attempt to make fair their labor contracts that Negro laborers had signed with white employers. Understand the situation that existed in Texas and the South after the Civil War. At the end of the Civil War, 2 million Negroes, formerly in the institution of slavery, were freed and became citizens, allegedly, once the 14th Amendment was adopted, to the United States. These new citizens, when they were slaves, southern states had passed laws that prohibited Negroes, any white person, from educating a Negro. So at the end of the Civil War, you had 2 million illiterate new citizens of the United States. And blacks had never worked in the institution of slavery for a wage, and blacks didn't understand the value of money. So throughout the South and in Texas, Negroes signed labor contracts, and they signed contracts marking them with an X because they couldn't read and write, signed their name. And these labor contracts sometimes were for an entire year's work, and it committed the Negro to work for a solid year for a plantation owner, let's say. And if, let's say, $20 a month was a fair wage, and I don't know what a fair wage was in those days, but if $20 a month was a fair wage, many of these contracts were for $10 or $5 because Negroes didn't understand what they were committing to in these labor contracts. The Freedmen's Bureau came in and challenged in court many of these unfair labor contracts, and the Freedmen's Bureau began to educate Negroes in Texas throughout the South. The same year that the Freedmen's Bureau came to Texas, by the end of the year, the Freedmen's Bureau was operating hundreds of schools, and there were 6,499 Negro children being educated in the schools provided by the Freedmen's Bureau. One Texas historian has suggested that Texas blacks were in a terrible situation, in a kind of legal no man's land after the American Civil War, and that 1% of all Texas black males aged 15 to 49 were killed by whites in Texas from 1865 to 1868. Lynch law prevailed in Texas, and when a black man did something offensive to a white, the white man simply executed him, shot him to death, took him out and hung him from a tree, and no one was going to prosecute, no white man was going to prosecute another white man for killing a Negro, and Negroes didn't have a right to go into court and challenge whites, and so lynch law was a way of life in Texas. Whites often saw the Freedmen's Bureau as a bunch of carpetbaggers, Northerners coming into Texas for political gain. But the Freedmen's Bureau had 70 field agents, and they really did make a difference in helping these new Negro citizens and even poor whites in Texas and in the southern states. Unhappy Texans also began to resist by 1868 Union occupation of Texas. The troops, federal troops that were in Texas. The very existence of the military, United States military in Texas, violated the Republican principles that Texans so loved. And soon these Yankee troops were condemned, and there was even some cases of hit and run guerrilla tactics against Union supply trains and small military details. And the very existence of Negro troops in uniform, in blue uniforms in Texas, after the Civil War, was an incredible offense to the white citizens of Texas. In some cases, these federal troops responded violently. We know that that Negro troops finally got so upset with the citizens of Brenham, Texas, that the Negro troops virtually burned the city of Brenham, Texas to the ground. Indeed, the events of the Throckmorton years as governor, Throckmorton, cemented the relationship between Texas Unionists and the National Republican Party. Presidential mandated Reconstruction was not protecting the Southern black man, and restoration of the Union would soon mean that Republican control of Congress would come to an end. Now let's spend a second, because that's important. Let me read that again. Presidential mandated Reconstruction wasn't protecting the black man, and that's what the radical Republicans in Congress wanted, because they had always wished to defend the black man. But when the South seceded from the Union, what had happened to the majority control in Congress? It had reverted from Democratic to Republican, and the most senior Republicans were the radical Republicans. So the radical Republicans now, after Civil War, had not only been not able to protect the black man, but if the southern states were going to be reconciled and brought back into the Union, these new southern state governments would inevitably turn from the Republicans to the Democrats, and Congress would become controlled by the Democrats once again. And that was a problem. And the Republicans recognized that if Reconstruction ever came to an end, then the Republicans were going to lose control of the United States Congress. In fact, March the 2nd, 1867, Because of the alleged allegations that blacks in Texas and other southern states were being abused, the radical Republicans in Congress passed the March 2, 1867 Reconstruction Act. President Johnson vetoed it, and Congress overrode his veto. The Radical Republican Reconstruction Act of March 2, 1867 declared illegal the existing state governments in Texas, including Throckmorton's Texas government. It divided the South into 5 military districts and granted U.S. generals control of each district, and the generals' control would be superior in authority to state law and to civilian government. For the southern states, the Reconstruction Act of March 2, 1867 immediately required a new state convention to be held in all southern states, and delegates had to be elected by the voters in an election that excluded all former Confederates, and required all of these new state constitutions that would be adopted to have approval of black suffrage. Philip Sheridan, former cavalry officer and general of the Union, commanded the 5th Military District of Texas and Louisiana, and General Charles Griffin, Griffin, Charles Griffin, commanded the sub-district of Texas. Pledging his support for the Radical Republican Act, Governor J.W. Throckmorton soon offended General Griffin when Throckmorton refused to blanket pardon 227 Negro convicts in the Texas penitentiary. Griffin went to Philip Sheridan, and on July the 30th of 1867, General Sheridan, because he had superiority to the civilian governments of Louisiana and Texas, removed Governor Throckmorton, calling him, quote, an impediment to Reconstruction, end quote. And in his place, Sheridan appointed former Governor E.M. Peace, who Throckmorton had earlier defeated. General Griffin continued to control the civil government of Texas and rigidly applied the standards of the March 3, 1867 Reconstruction Act, excluding all who had once held public office and then taken an oath of allegiance to the Confederate States of America. After Throckmorton, many other Texas Democrats were replaced on the state and local level. And fortuitously, if anybody can ever die of fortuitously, it was that General Griffin contracted yellow fever in late 1867. But his successor, General J.J. Reynolds, continued to remove many who he called rebel officials. However, 2 months later, General Winfield Scott Hancock succeeded Sheridan as the head of the 5th Military District in New Orleans. Hancock was a Northern Democrat who had held the line at Gettysburg against Pickett's charge in 1863. He was a Democrat, but a Northern Democrat. He became head of the 5th Military District and almost immediately notified Texas civil officials to return to their normal functions of government, and it was General Hancock who authorized 5,000 additional Texas voters from the ranks of former Confederates. When registration of voters for the 1868 election of delegates to a constitutional convention was completed, the Texas rolls revealed that there were 59,603 eligible white voters and 49,479 eligible black voters in Texas. Texas disenfranchised numbers totaled around 10,000 whites who had been former Confederates who couldn't vote in 1868. The Union Loyal League of the GAR courted the Texas black vote, and in some cases the Ku Klux Klan attempted to undercut blacks and to intimidate them into not voting. The election of delegates in 1868 was to be held in each Texas county for 5 consecutive days, February the 10th through the 14th, 1868, and the law that set up this election required a majority of registered voters in each Texas county to participate in order to legitimatize the results. While initially seeking to boycott the vote, Texas Democratic officials finally decided that they would encourage Democrats to vote no to a constitutional convention and yes to opposing black suffrage. When the voters went to the polls, the final vote count for a constitutional convention was 44,000 voting in support of having a constitutional convention to only 11,400 opposing. So Texas was going to have a constitutional convention. But of the 44,000 who voted for the convention, 36,900 were Negro voters and only 7,757 white voters voted for a constitutional convention. On the other hand, of the 11,400 who voted against a constitutional convention, 10,622 of those were white voters and only 818 Negro voters opposed a constitutional convention. So the vote for a constitutional convention was divided on racial lines. The Constitutional Convention opened in Austin on June the 1st of 1868. There were 94 delegates. 10 of them were black, 84 were white. There were 10 Democrats, 78 Republicans, and a handful of independents. Former unionist and governor of Texas, A.J. Hamilton, who was considered a Republican moderate, had the support of the 10 Democrats. Radical Republicans were led by Edmund J. Davis, Morgan Hamilton, who was A.J. Hamilton's brother on the other side of the fence, so to speak, James Newcomb, and George T. Ruby, who was the black carpetbag president of the Texas Union League of Negro voters. The radicals favored ordinances of disenfranchisement for all who had been associated with the Confederacy, and they supported a principle in this constitutional convention, the radicals did, called ab initio, A-B, new word, I-N-I-T-I-O, ab initio. Ab initio was the belief that the Ordinance of Secession in 1861 was not valid, and so any subsequent official act of the Confederate state government was also invalid during the war. Ab initio, after a long and bitter debate, was rejected, and by a 45-28 vote, the delegates validated all Texas state acts during 1861-1865 that were, quote, not in violation of the United States Constitution and laws of the United States and not in aid of the rebellion, end quote. The radicals temporarily delayed the convention by attempting then to create a new state out of the western regions of Texas, because you remember part of the annexation treaty with the United States that brought the Republic of Texas into the Union was that Texas had, as we still have today, the right to subdivide ourselves if we wish. And there were German Unionists in the Texas Hill Country, so the radical Republicans said, let's create a state of West Texas and draw up a proposed constitution for an independent state of West Texas. The convention worked on a constitution, but delayed a constitution for the entire state of Texas until after the November 1868 presidential elections, because the radical Republicans, the moderate Republicans, and the 10 Democrats in the state convention, each faction hoped that the outcome in the presidential election of November 1868 would strengthen their hand. The convention adjourned until the first Monday in December of 1868. In the interim, in the November 1868 election, Ulysses Grant was elected president, and the radical Republicans in Texas were convinced that Grant would support their cause. So, in January of 1869, when the convention reconvened, the bitter debate was had on a constitution of the state of West Texas, but they voted that constitution down. Then the Texas Convention voted to oppose the restoration of East Texas to statehood because of the massive violence there against freedmen, and sent a delegation of Texas individuals to Washington to lobby for the political division of Texas. However, moderate conservative faction gained control, and they finally approved a proposed state constitution of Texas for 1869 and began to engross it, have it printed. And having lost every single vote in that convention, ab initio, the vote on statehood for West Texas, disenfranchisement of the black man, E.J. Davis in early February of 1869 then tried to engineer the collapse of the convention before a final vote could be had on the proposed 1869 Constitution. The moderate A.J. Hamilton faction took control, seized the records of the convention, and promptly turned them over to General Hancock, the presiding officer of the 5th Military District, before the convention could adjourn on February 8, 1869. Hancock ordered that the work of the convention be completed by a committee of 3 individuals appointed by himself, and later that work was eventually approved by 46 delegates who had attended the convention, including E.J. Davis, who had been ordered to resign from the convention by the governor, and 7 other radical Republicans eventually signed the 1869 proposed Texas State Constitution. The 1869 Constitution of Texas disenfranchised only those Texans disqualified by the United States Constitution. It called for male suffrage, the right of Negro males to vote. The 1869 proposed Constitution lengthened the terms of Texas state officials in office. It granted the next governor of Texas massive appointive power. It abolished state courts, and as strange as that was, the 1869 proposed Constitution had one good feature. The document called for, the convention called for 1/4 of annual state taxes and the proceeds of 1/4 of annual state sale of land to be set aside for public education in Texas. So this was it's called the Radical Republican Constitution of 1869. The truth is that E.J. Davis and other radical Republicans tried first to get Congress and Grant to reject the document. When that failed, the radical Republicans in Texas then endorsed the proposed Constitution of 1869 and nominated Edmund J. Davis to run as the next governor of Texas under the Constitution of 1869. Conservative Democrats rallied around the moderate Republican A.J. Hamilton, former Unionist. Conservative Democrats fought hard, but the Union Loyal League, blacks, and General J.J. Reynolds, who appointed Davis men to registration boards, stacked the deck and ensured Davis's election. And it didn't help that many diehard Democrats refused to support a moderate Republican like A.J. Hamilton. Held the last day of November and the first 3 days in December of 1869, the election results were never publicly announced were never publicly announced in newspapers to the citizens of Texas. When the vote was certified in January 8th of 1870, the results revealed Davis won the election as governor by a vote of 39,901 for E.J. Davis to 39,093 voters for Hamilton. and Hamilton believed that he was denied victory by a corrupt vote count, and perhaps he was. The Constitution of 1869 itself was adopted by a vote of, overwhelmingly adopted by a vote of 72,466 for adoption and only 4,928 voting against adoption. What's interesting is the vote count. If you add the number of votes that Davis and Hamilton both garnered, you get a total of 78,993. But only 77,394 voted for or against the adoption of the Constitution. So more people voted in the governor's race than voted for the constitutional, the vote on the Constitution, which implies that probably Davis election officials added a few votes to provide the margin of victory, because his margin of victory was about 890 votes or something. So the reality is that under the election that occurred, 3 of 4 Texas congressmen to represent Texas in the House of Representatives were Republicans. The 4th was J.C. Connor, who was a Democrat, but he had been a United States Army officer, and he was a carpetbagger from the North. When evidence in September of 1869 revealed that Governor Reynolds was helping the radical Republicans, Governor Elijah M. Peace resigned in protest. And so Governor Reynolds ran Texas without a governor until January the 8th of 1870, the day that he certified the election count for E.J. Davis. And General Reynolds then appointed the elected officials to serve before their terms technically began in order to provide government for Texas. On February the 8th of 1870, the 12th Texas legislature convened and immediately elected Morgan Hamilton, Radical Republican, and J.W. Flanagan, Radical Republican, to the United States Senate. On March the 30th of 1870, the Texas delegation was seated in Congress, and Congress dropped the, quote, provisional titles before all state government officials. In April the 16th, 1870, General J.J. Reynolds ended military rule by formally granting control of Texas to Texas elected officials. So in one sense, Reconstruction had come to an end by April 1870, as Texas was restored to the Union, but Texas was under radical Republican control, and E.J. Davis was the scallywag, not a carpetbagger. He was a native Texan. He was the scallywag radical Republican governor of Texas. At that point, we want to stop now, and we'll come back and talk about radical Republican control and an end to Reconstruction in Texas. And then we'll look at briefly how the new redeemed redeemed Democratic governments of Texas weren't any better than the radical Republicans had been. And that'll get us to the point of our second test. Have a good day. I'll see you around campus, and I'll see you in the clouds. Later.